The Bitterroot Mountains were all sharp edges and tinder that week, ridgelines saw-toothed against a sky the color of old nickel. I had been laying rock on a switchback above Burnt Creek all afternoon, then traded my trail hammer for a Pulaski, when the volunteer radio crackled with a tone out. Dry lightning had stitched fire across 3 ridges, and the wind, always the real boss, was pushing the hottest flank straight at a bowl of deadfall and slashed the loggers never packed out. By sundown, the air was butter-thick with smoke. You do not breathe in that kind of air so much as you sip it and hope it does not cut. I wet my bandana in a trickle running down the ditch and tied it over my nose. The world shrank to a cone of headlamp and the rhythm of metal hitting earth. Chop, scrape, throw. My name is Elias Dorn, 38 that summer, by trade a backcountry trail builder and part-time sawyer, by temperament the sort of man who prefers one good tool to a garage full of gadgets. We had a task and a line to hold. The crew boss, a rancher named Moore with a barbed wire voice, kept us in a staggered chain along the slope, spaced out so we would not all get swallowed if the wind did something stupid. The wind did something stupid. When a fire crowns in the lodgepole, it does not ask if you are ready. It just climbs, bark to branch to needle, a staircase of heat right into the night. One moment I could hear Moore yelling to keep low and keep swinging. The next, embers were coming down sideways, and a gust made the snags on the far rim shiver with orange. The radio popped, then squealed itself into uselessness. Someone whistled the retreat signal, 3 short, 2 long, and boots started moving. I should have moved with them. I did move at first. Down slope, toward a cutover where the dozer line would be clean and the engine crew would set up a wet edge. But halfway there, I heard a sound that did not belong to fire or tool or man. 2 sounds, actually. Sharp, thin, staggered like hiccups. Not the panicked bawl of a fawn, not the high crackle of lodgepole cones popping their seeds. This was something else. A whetstone being tapped, a rapid staccato that froze the hair along my arms even in that heat. I stopped and swept my headlamp left. Smoke makes its own fog. The beam caught it and bloomed it to milk. I cut the light and let my ears do what eyes could not. There, off to my right, in a pocket where the creek cut a ribbon of green through all that black and orange. Another whistle blew. Someone shouted my name once, twice, then swallowed by the big sound of flame finding something it liked. I told myself I would take 10 steps, look, and then move. 10 became 20, and then the ground under me dropped into a narrow swale where the creek ran shin-deep and shiny as oil. I crouched and crawled along it, face near the water, for the cool and the clean. The tapping sounds came again, faster now, followed by a quavering note that clenched my gut, the way a baby's first raw cry does. They were right there when I crested the far bank. 2 small bodies huddled together against a downed fir, skin hidden under soot and singed hair, eyes a startling animal amber in the reflected firelight. They were not human. They were not any animal I had ever seen up close. They were exactly what half the old men in Hamilton swear they saw back in the 70s, and exactly what every biologist I have ever had coffee with laughs off as campfire talk. They were, there is no other honest word, Bigfoot infants. Twins. One of them, later I would learn her rhythm and call her Ember, had both hands splayed on the char, palms blistered where she had tried to crawl. The other, Ash, because he already seemed to blend into whatever shadow he was given, kept one arm around her shoulders and peered at me with a look I have seen on new calves and lost children and cornered coyotes alike. A feral math, trying to add me up and find the safest answer. He made the tapping sound again, rapid, like teeth on wood. Where you expect differences, there were similarities to us that rattled me. 5-fingered hands, broad feet that were far too big for their bodies, a flat, broad nose, a brow heavier than a child's ought to be. Where you expect similarities, there were differences that told me I was out beyond any map. A crest of hair already forming, a deep chest that heaved on a rhythm I could feel more than hear, and those voices, yes, voices, laid in harmonics that vibrated my ribs. Behind them, stamped into the ash in a clean line, were tracks the size of plates, not mine, not any crew members. Each one sunk deep enough to tell of weight past guessing, each one spaced on a stride that would make a sprinter jealous. They angled into the dark where the crown was already running, needles torching off trees like somebody up there was shaking sparklers. "Hey," I said, as if that word had any meaning across whatever gap lay between us. "Hey!" Ember coughed, a tiny choking thing, and reached for the sound of my voice, and then yanked her palm back with a hiss. Ash flared his lips enough to show square, human flat teeth, not canines like a cat. And then he did something I still dream about 15 years later. He put his small burnt hand on his own chest, and then he touched Ember's shoulder, and then he tapped the log they were crouched against. Me, her, this, a sentence as clear as any I have heard without words. A branch exploded behind me, and a wash of heat slapped the side of my face. The wind had shifted again. In another minute, the creek pocket would be a chimney. There are moments in a life when you understand that whatever comes next will wreck the shape of your days, and you step anyway. I stripped my bandana, dunked it hard in the creek until it went from red to black, and pressed it over Ember's mouth and nose. She squirmed, then stilled when the wet brought something like relief. I shrugged out of my canvas overshirt and ripped the back seam into 2 long flaps, made a sling of each. Ash flinched when I slid a hand under his chest, then grabbed my forearm with fingers that could have broken a wrist if he meant it. Ember made that tapping sound, and this time it was slower, slow, as I lifted her. I tucked one sling under each of them, crisscrossed the tails over my chest so their weight would ride high where my breath could still find air below, and stood. They were heavier than human toddlers, dense the way a black bear cub is dense, but I have carried rock loads up worse slopes, and adrenaline is a fuel you do not analyze while you have it. I took the route I knew would work, back down into the creek silhouette where the heat would go up and the water would give me clean breaths now and again. Halfway to the bend, I felt a pressure change. You can feel size. You cannot see the way you feel a storm an hour before it hits. The smoke at the far edge of the pocket moved against itself, and 2 orange coin reflections blinked on and off. Eyes, higher than mine by 2 feet, easy. They held a steady line on me, then cut past me to where Ash's foot dangled and Ember's sling wrapped her belly. Every hair on my nape rose. I stopped, put one boot on the bank so I could pivot if I had to. You learn a lot by whether wild things charge or do not. I had nothing to offer but the truth. I pressed my own hand against my chest where the slings crossed and said, low and steady, safe. The word was for me as much as whatever watched. Safe, safe. The eyes narrowed. A sound rolled through that smoke like a low drum carried in a wagon over a gravel road. No threat in it, but a weight, an oldness. It made my sternum buzz. Then the eyes were gone, the smoke gulped back into itself, and the crown took that sector with a noise like wet canvas ripping. I went. I kept to the creek until the dozer line opened like a greasy parking lot, the clay scuffed raw and shining under the headlamp beams. I stumbled once, twice. Ash's grip tightened with each misstep, and Ember tucked her head against my collarbone in a way that made me vow to parts of the night I had never prayed to. Engine folk found me 100 yards shy of my truck. Someone yelled my name like I had just come out of the ocean. Hands reached for the bundles. I twisted. "No," I said, and whatever was in my voice made them freeze. "No, I have got them." I do not remember unlocking the truck or cranking the vent windows or the drive down the service road, except in slices. The sharp cooling, the taste of ash in the teeth, the twins' chests rising steady against mine, the way Ember's hand found my wrist and stayed there like a small clamp of trust. The rancher boss stepped into my headlights at the junction, then stepped out when he saw my face. "Get to the station," he hollered. "We'll sweep for stragglers. Radio's back in an hour." I did not go to the station. I took the old section road that winds behind my place, the one no one uses since the timber sale closed. 4 miles as the crow flies, 9 as a man who likes to go unseen. My cabin is a simple thing. Rough lap siding, a wood stove that sulks and sings, a table I built from a wind-thrown cottonwood, and a root cellar cut into the slope, lined with river stone and oak beams. It stays cool even in August. It smells like earth you can trust. I had lined part of it with shelves for jars of chokecherry preserves and pickled green beans. There was room enough for a nest. I laid 'em there on the old wool blanket my grandmother had brought across the Dakotas when she married a man with a threshing rig and a good singing voice. Ember coughed again, and when I wiped her lips with a corner of the blanket, the soot came away shining. Burns scalloped both their palms, small blisters already rising, and Ember's forearms wore kiss marks from hot needles that had fallen and burned their way in. I had a little honey in a mason jar, raw and gold. I had calendula petals in a brown paper bag, dried last summer on a screen by the stove. I had read in one of my grandmother's herbals that the two together make a salve the skin likes. I boiled water on the stove. I boiled it again. I worked by lantern, the good glass kind that does not hiss so loud you cannot hear yourself think. They watched me work. Ash tracked every motion the way a man tracks a dealer's hands when the cards start to get slick. Ember made that tapping sound when the pot lid rattled, asking. When the salve cooled, I touched only my own wrist at first to show what it was. They flinched anyway when I reached for their small hands, then loosened when the cool hit. Little by little I coated those burn-scored palms. I wrapped them in strips of an old clean shirt. Ember leaned forward, pressed her mouth to my knuckle, and hummed, a note so soft I would have missed it if the whole world had not gone quiet around it. Gratitude. I did not need a dictionary. Food was a problem. Milk at that hour is something you have to get from a neighbor, if you are me. I did not like leaving them, but I had to. I walked up the slope and left the cellar door open enough so the air would not go stale. On my way out, I put my hand to my chest and then toward the door. Me, back. The word is not in the hands, but the sense is. They made no move to follow. Ash tucked his good palm under Ember's elbow, and Ember tucked her chin like someone who has decided to wait. Ada Rook lives a mile and a half up the road in a house that sags toward her goat pen the way an old mare leans into a fence when the flies are bad. She has 3 Sannons and sells milk and cheese to anyone with cash. She also has a son with a badge and a habit of asking questions like he is friendly when he is testing your answer for lies. Her porch light was on. I knocked, and Ada opened with her shawl tight around her shoulders, and that knowing smile she keeps for men who think they have secrets. "Elias," she said, "if you are out in this, you must need something or be running from something. Which is it?" "Goat milk," I said, "and quick. A gallon if you can spare it. I will pay you double." "Double says there is more to it," she said, and then her eyes sharpened. "You burned?" "A kiss on the arm. I will live." She squinted past me at the sky. The glow to the west had gone sullen and wide. "Take the milk, then, and take this old bottle of gripe water my sister sent. It is for human babies. But it will not hurt a goat neither, and it will not hurt whatever else you have up your sleeve." I met her eyes a second too long, and she knew she had hit something. Ada never pushes where she is not wanted. It is one of the reasons I trust her more than most. "Bring my jars back when you can," she said. "And Elias?" Some things do not want saving, some things do. The hard part is telling which is which in the dark." "I will bring your jars," I said. "Thank you." Back in the cellar, the twins had pulled the blanket into a heap and crawled into the hollow of it. They had fallen into a sleep that was more truce than rest. Their chests rose shallow and fast. I warmed the milk in a pot until it was just shy of blood warm, cut it with a little water, and mashed in a handful of huckleberries from the freezer for sugar and something familiar. I had no bottle. I improvised with a leather Bota bag I had never used, cleaned to within an inch of its life, and fitted with a small whittled spout. Ash would not take it first. Ember would. She latched on like any hungry mouth and took 3 greedy pulls, then pulled back and coughed. I rubbed her back and said the same stupid, soothing syllables you say to any baby of any species when you do not know what else to do. Ash watched. He made a small 2-click sound, then leaned and took his turn. It went like that until they both had pinked up enough to look less like a charcoal sketch and more like beings with blood under the skin. I do not remember falling asleep, but I must have, because the lantern was out when I opened my eyes, and the cellar smelled like cool stone and goat and singe. Gray light was trying to find me through the high window. The twins were not in the blanket. I came up too quick and saw the shape near the far corner, big enough to make my heart hit once hard. Then it resolved to smaller. 2 of them. They had found the seed potatoes on the lower shelf and arranged them in 2 messy rows, 4 and 4, then pressed their bandaged hands to their chests one after the other. Ash, Ember, counting, a declaration of 2. I smiled. It was a foolish thing to do when my life had just tripped and fallen down a flight of stairs I could not see the bottom of, but it came anyway. We were not done with the night. The radio on my table upstairs crackled. A voice that sounded like Moore's, but could have been any tired man, said words about containment and spot fires and a lost Sawyer with a busted ankle. Then a new voice, thin and clipped, asked about unidentified wildlife moving along the creek draw and whether the engine crew had eyes on the anomaly. I turned the knob down until the voice was a bug under glass. Something thumped on the porch. Not the creak of a board. My cabin is honest about its noises and tattles on everything, but a deliberate weight set down where a man would set a boot. The cellar door is under the porch. The porch is 5 boards and a prayer above that door. Ash's head snapped to the sound. Ember went still in a way that made the boards themselves seem loud. I put 2 fingers to my lips and 2 to my chest and let my breath go in a long, steady line. Quiet. Me. Calm. The thump came again, softer. Something slid across the porch, wood on wood. A gift or a warning, I could not tell. I crept the cellar steps and eased the main door open with my foot. Smoke lay like a tired animal over the yard. On the porch, a cedar round the size of my palm sat where the mat would be if I were the sort to have one. The bark had been stripped. Its face was blackened and etched with rings made not by growth but by fire. In the center, burned with something hot and narrow, a dot. I did not touch it. On the far side of the clearing at the tree line, where my trail disappears into fir and larch, the smoke was thicker than it ought to be. Nothing orange, but a density that said a large body had passed and pushed the air aside not a minute before. I picked up the cedar round then, careful as if it might bite, and carried it back down. Ash saw it and went rigid, then made a low, tight sound I had not heard from him yet, a humming that thrummed between fear and hunger and home. Ember reached out and touched the dot with the tip of one finger. Then she pressed that finger to my chest. Me. Here. I am not in the habit of thinking my life is important enough to be the center of anyone's map. That morning, I understood I had been mapped, not by the county, by someone whose hands burned pictures into wood. I set the round on a shelf and bowed my head to it like a fool. When I looked up, Ash had crawled across the stone, put his burnt palm flat against my sternum, and pushed. Not hard, not a shove, a placing. He held it there until my breath synced with his for 3 long counts. I am not a man who cries easy. The heat of the night had finished what the mountain winter started in me years ago. It had dried up the trivial tears. The ones that came then were not trivial. They were water at the bottom of the well. I did not go back to the burn that day. It was not cowardice. It was a triage only I was in the room for. 2 small lives I had lifted out of a creek pocket versus a forest with men enough to cut lines and engines enough to lay hose. I listened to the radio and took cue from the cadence of voices, from the moments when people talked too fast or not at all. When the engine crew muttered about a downed snag across the 2-track, I walked up with my saw and cleared it and did not answer questions. In the evening, when the wind lay down and the heat slunk back into the stones, I carried the twins into the woodshed where I had hung old quilts to make a cave. I sat with them while they slept the drunk sleep of exhausted babies and tried to remember what normal had ever meant. In my notebook, a green canvas one with frayed corners and pencil grooves where I pressed too hard, I wrote what I could not say on any radio. 2 infant Sasquatch discovered in fire pocket at Burnt Creek Draw, carried to safety, burns to hands treated with honey and calendula, goat milk accepted with reluctance, then interest, vocalizations, tapping, humming, 2-tone clicks, palms to chest gesture observed repeatedly to indicate self and perhaps gratitude. Eye shine at initial sight, adult presence, vocalization from adult, non-threatening, resonant, left cedar round etched with central dot, interpretation, assessment, Warning? Claim? At the bottom of the page, I wrote a sentence that my hand did not want to write, because the sentence made me complicit with a secret bigger than my life. I cannot tell anyone. That first night, when I finally crawled into my bed, after checking the cellar 3 times to be sure both chests were rising and falling, I dreamed of eyes the size of my fists looking at me through smoke. In the dream, they were not accusing, not pleading, just watching, as if to say, now you know. Now you have to be the kind of man you have been telling yourself you are. Just before sleep took me, I heard it again, not in a dream, outside. A low, deep note that made the panes in the windows tremble a little. A reply, if you have the nerve to call it that, from a throat built to carry sound through 6 miles of timber. I put my hand on my chest in the dark and tapped once, a human copying a language he did not yet know how to speak. I did not know it then, but I had just given the first answer in the longest conversation of my life. The fire ran for 11 more days before the weather broke, and the crews could call it contained. In that time, I became a liar by necessity and a caretaker by instinct. The twins did not cry the way human babies do, pitched and insistent, but they made their needs known through posture and sound, and I learned the vocabulary fast because there was no other choice. Ember favored the corner of the cellar where the air moved slowest and the stone stayed coldest. She would press her bandaged palms to the wall and hum until the vibration settled her. Ash explored every inch of the space in those first days, running his good hand along the shelves, sniffing the jars of pickles and jam, testing the give of the floorboards overhead. He mapped it the way a wolf maps a den. I kept them hidden during daylight. At night, when the roads went quiet and the fire crews were too tired to patrol anything but their own eyelids, I would carry them into the woodshed where the air was dry and smelled of pitch and cedar. I hung a quilt from the rafters to make a shelter within a shelter, strung a kerosene lamp low enough to give warmth without glare, and let them stretch limbs that were already growing at a pace that alarmed me. By the end of the first week, Ember had shed the worst of her blisters and could grip my thumb without flinching. Ash's burns healed even faster, scabbing over with a thick, waxy layer that reminded me of the way birch bark seals a wound. I kept applying the honey salve more out of ritual than necessity. It seemed to calm them, and calm was the commodity I needed most. Food became the next puzzle. The goat milk worked, but only to a point. Ember took it readily, but Ash would turn his head after a few swallows and make a low, dissatisfied grunt. I tried bread soaked in broth. He sniffed it and pushed it aside. I tried venison jerky from my winter stores. He chewed it once and spat it into his palm, then looked at me with what I can only describe as polite disappointment. It was Ada who gave me the clue without knowing it. She stopped by 3 days after the first milk run, ostensibly to check on my burn, which had already gone from angry red to dull pink, but really to satisfy her curiosity. I met her at the gate rather than invite her up to the porch. "You look like a man who has not slept," she said, handing me a jar of her tomato relish, "or a man who is sleeping in shifts." "The fire keeps me edgy," I said, which was true enough. She tilted her head the way a hawk does when it spots movement in tall grass. "Well, if you are feeding something other than yourself, remember that young things need fat and variety. Goat milk is fine, but if it is a fawn or a cub you are tending, bring them fish, mashed berries, roots if you can get them tender, Wild things know what they need better than we do. I nodded and thanked her and watched her walk back down the road with her skirt swishing against the fireweed. That evening, I drove to the creek below my property and caught 4 cutthroat trout with my hands. It is a skill my father taught me when I was small. Patience, stillness, and the willingness to let cold water numb you until the fish forgets you are a threat. I cleaned the trout and mashed the meat with the back of a wooden spoon, mixing in huckleberries and a pinch of salt. I brought it down to the cellar in a wooden bowl my grandmother had turned on a lathe 60 years ago. Ash smelled it before I set it down. His head came up sharp, nostrils flaring, and he crossed the space in 2 loping steps. Ember followed, slower but just as intent. They ate with their hands, scooping and licking and making soft, chuffing sounds that I took for approval. When the bowl was empty, Ash pressed his palm to his chest, then to mine, then tapped the bowl twice. More. Please. Thank you. The grammar was flexible, but the meaning was clear. From that night forward, fish became the center of their diet. I supplemented with berries, salmon berries, thimbleberries, service berries as they came into season, and wild greens, miner's lettuce, fiddlehead ferns in spring, young dandelion leaves. I learned by watching what they accepted and what they ignored. They would not touch anything that had been cooked over direct flame, but they loved anything smoked or dried. They would eat the roe from a trout with reverence, passing it back and forth in their palms like a sacrament. I began to understand that I was not raising orphans. I was hosting guests whose culture was older and more specific than my own. Communication evolved in layers. The first layer was necessity, hunger, pain, cold, fear. The second layer was observation. Ash learned to mimic the cadence of my footsteps so well that I would sometimes turn, expecting to see him, and find only the wind moving a tarp. Ember learned the sound of the truck engine and would tilt her head whenever I came up the road, tracking me before I was visible. The third layer was intentional. One morning in late September, I found them arranging river stones on the cellar floor in 2 parallel lines, each stone a hand's width from the next. Ash tapped his chest, then touched the left line. Ember did the same with the right. Then Ash picked up a stick of kindling and drew a circle in the dust around both lines. I stared at it for a long time. 2 paths, 1 boundary, us. I knelt and added a third line of stones between theirs, smaller, made from pebbles I pulled from my pocket. I tapped my chest and touched the center line. They watched me, heads tilted in mirror angles, and then Ash reached out and moved one of my pebbles so it sat between his stone and Ember's. Not separate, between. That was the day I understood they were not simply learning to live with me. They were teaching me to live with them. I made mistakes, more than I can count. In October, I brought home a battery-powered radio, a small one, the kind you clip to your belt on a trail crew, because I wanted to monitor fire reports and weather without cranking the big shortwave in the cabin. I turned it on in the woodshed to test it, and the static that poured out sent both twins into a panic. Ember flattened herself against the wall, hands over her ears, keening. Ash bared his teeth and struck the ground with both fists, a percussive thump that rattled the tools on the bench. I killed the radio and shoved it into my pack. It took 20 minutes of sitting still, breathing slow, before they would come near me again. I never brought it into their space after that. Another time, in November, I thought it would be clever to hang a mirror on the inside of the woodshed so I could check for headlights or movement without stepping outside. The first time Ember saw her own reflection, she lunged at it with a clicking snarl and cracked the glass with her palm. Blood welled from a shallow cut. I pulled the mirror down and wrapped her hand, and she sat in the corner facing the wall for an hour, shivering. Ash sat beside her, grooming the hair along her shoulder with his fingers, and did not look at me. I learned no sudden sounds, no reflective surfaces, no fire inside their shelter, no dogs, no cats, no visitors, and above all, no assumptions that because they looked almost human in some lights, they would think or feel like us. They were not human. They were something older, and I was the student. By winter, they had outgrown the cellar. Ash could no longer stand upright without ducking, and Ember's shoulders were broad enough that she had to turn sideways to fit through the door. I began to panic in a quiet, methodical way. How do you hide two growing creatures in a valley where everyone knows the shape of everyone else's smoke and the sound of their truck and the rhythm of their comings and goings? The answer came from the land itself. Behind my cabin, the slope rises into a thick stand of Douglas fir and larch, and beneath that stand is a basalt shelf, riddled with shallow caves and overhangs. I had used one of those overhangs to store tools and bags of lime for the outhouse. In December, during a cold snap that turned the snow to powder, I began to dig. I dug at night, by moonlight and the dim glow of a shielded headlamp. I dug with a mattock and a spade and my hands when the tools could not reach. I excavated a tunnel from the crawl space beneath my cabin, a space I had framed but never finished, out through the slope to the overhang. It took me 6 weeks. My shoulders ached in ways I had not felt since my 20s. I shored the tunnel with salvaged beams and tin sheeting I scrounged from an abandoned homestead 10 miles west. I disguised the exit with a false rock face made from chicken wire, burlap, and mud mixed with moss. When it was done, I crawled through it twice to make sure it would hold, then brought the twins up from the cellar and showed them the passage. Ash went first. He moved through the tunnel on all fours, his knuckles barely clearing the low ceiling, and emerged into the overhang with his head swiveling to take in the new perimeter. Ember followed, pausing halfway to sniff the beams, testing them with a palm. When she came out, she stood to her full height, already taller than me by half a head, and exhaled a sound that was part sigh, part song. The overhang became their sanctuary. I lined it with straw bales and old wool blankets. I strung a tarp across the open side to break the wind, but left gaps for airflow. I brought them a wooden crate to store things they collected, feathers, stones, strips of bark they wove into mats. At night, I would sit at the mouth of the tunnel and listen to them moving above me, their weight creaking the boards, their voices a low duet of hums and clicks that made the dark feel less alone. It was in that overhang, in the heart of winter, that I began to teach them what I knew and learn what they would show me. I am not a school teacher. I finished high school by the skin of my teeth and learned my trade through apprenticeship and error. But I had books, field guides, atlases, an old astronomy text with star charts my father had marked up in the margins, and I had a belief, however naive, that knowledge is a kindness. I started with pictures. I drew simple images on slates made from smooth river stones, a fish, a tree, the moon, a hand. I would point to the image, then to the real thing, then back to the image. Ash understood immediately. Within a week, He could draw a passable fish himself, his line shaky but intentional. Ember took longer, but when she finally drew a circle and tapped the sky, I understood she was asking me to name the moon. I wrote the word in charcoal, moon. She traced it with one finger, then drew her own symbol beside it, a crescent with 3 lines radiating out. Her word in her language. I pointed to my word, then to hers, and nodded. She exhaled through her nose. A sound I had learned meant satisfaction. We built a vocabulary that winter. Water, fire, cold, safe, danger, wait, come, go. They learned my words faster than I learned theirs, but I tried. Their language was not spoken so much as shaped. Hums that changed meaning with pitch and duration, clicks that varied by rhythm, and gestures that carried as much weight as any syllable. A palm pressed flat to the chest meant self. 2 palms together, then pulled apart, meant separation or loss. A slow blink while holding eye contact meant trust. One night, in January, when the snow was piled high enough to muffle the world, Ash took a piece of charcoal and drew on the stone wall of the overhang. He drew 2 small figures side by side, then a much larger figure behind them. Then he drew flames. He paused, looked at me, and tapped the 2 small figures, him, Ember. He tapped the large figure and made a low, rolling hum that sank into my chest and stayed there. "Your mother," I said, though I did not know if that word meant anything to him, or your father. He tapped the flames, then tapped his own chest. Then he pressed both palms to the ground and closed his eyes. Gone. Lost. Taken. I sat with him in that cold, and I did not try to say it would be all right, because I have never liked being lied to, and I would not start with him. I put my hand on his shoulder, and he leaned into it, the way a tree leans into the wind when it has no choice but to bend. Ember came and sat on his other side. She did not make a sound. She simply pressed her palm to his, and they stayed that way until the lamp burned low and the stars outside began to fade. Close calls came in waves. The first was in February, when a state fire investigator named Calloway drove up to my gate in a white truck with a clipboard and a cologne that smelled like new tires. He wanted to walk the burn scar, map the origin point, check for evidence of human carelessness. I told him the snow was too deep and the roads too rough. He told me he had chains. I told him I had work to do and no time to babysit. He narrowed his eyes. "You were on the line that night. You see anything unusual?" "I saw fire," I said, "and smoke, and men running when the wind turned. That unusual enough for you?" He wrote something on his clipboard. "Couple of the crew said you went off script, disappeared for a bit. I followed the creek out. Wind was bad. Radio died." He tapped his pen against the board. "Anyone else go that way?" "Not that I saw." He stared at me a beat longer than the comfortable, then got back in his truck. "I will be back when the snow melts. You keep your calendar open, Mr. Dorn." I watched him drive away and felt my pulse in my throat. That night, I moved a stack of firewood to block the crawlspace entrance from the outside and told Ash and Ember not to leave the overhang unless I gave the all-clear signal. 2 knocks, pause, 1 knock. They understood. They always understood faster than I wanted them to. The second close call came in March, during the fall-spring, when the snow turns to slush and every animal with a stomach comes looking for food. A pack of coyotes, 7 or 8 of them, lean and opportunistic, started circling my property at dusk. I heard them yipping in the timber, and I knew they had caught the scent of something they wanted. I armed myself with a shotgun and a spotlight and went looking. I found them at the base of the slope, just below the overhang, noses to the ground and tails low. One of them, a scarred male with a torn ear, looked at me and did not move. That is when I knew they were not afraid, and that made them dangerous. Before I could fire a warning shot, Ash stepped into the open at the mouth of the overhang. He was silhouetted against the tarp, broad-shouldered and still, and he made a sound I had never heard from him before, a deep, resonant hum that started low and climbed, layered with harmonics that seemed to come from his chest and throat at once. The coyotes froze, every one of them, locked in place as if the sound had weight. The scarred male's ears went flat, and he began to back away, slow and stiff-legged. The others followed. Within 30 seconds, the pack had melted into the timber, and the night went silent. I looked up at Ash. He tilted his head and tapped his chest once, then turned and disappeared back into the overhang. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my porch with the shotgun across my knees and wondered what else he could do that I had not seen. The third close call was not an animal. It was a human, and it was the one that scared me most. In late April, a man I knew only as Corbett, a trapper, an off-grid drifter who sold pelts in town and asked no questions of anyone, came walking up my road with a rifle slung and a dog on a rope. The dog was a hound, liver-spotted and loose-jowled, and it was pulling toward the slope with its nose working overtime. "Dorn!" Corbett called, and his voice had the gravel of a man who smoked hand rolls and drank bad coffee. "Your property got something dead on it. My dog's been tracking it for 2 miles. "Nothing dead here," I said, stepping off the porch. "Maybe a deer got taken by a cat. Happens." "This is not cat," he said. "This smells wrong, big, old. You been seeing tracks?" "No." The dog lunged toward the slope, baying now, and Corbett had to dig his heels in. "Let me take a look. If it is a carcass, I will haul it off your land. If it is a cat den, you will want to know." "No," I said again, and this time I let the word sit heavy. "You turn that dog around, Corbett. I do not want it tearing up my hillside." He looked at me the way men do when they are measuring whether to push or back off. The hound bayed again, and from somewhere up the slope, faint but unmistakable, came a single low note. Not a growl, not a hum, something in between. Corbett's face changed. "What the hell was that?" "Elk," I said. "That was not any elk." I stepped closer, and I let him see that I was done talking. "You are on my land, Corbett. That dog goes, or you do. Your choice." He stared at me, then spat into the dirt. "All right. Keep your secrets, Dorn. But when whatever you are hiding comes down into town, do not say I did not warn you." He hauled the dog back down the road, and I stood there until they were out of sight. Then I went up the tunnel and found Ash and Ember pressed against the back wall of the overhang, eyes wide, breathing fast. I gave them the all-clear signal, and then I sat with them until dusk, not speaking, just present. That was the night I found the gift. At the far edge of the clearing near the tree line, someone had arranged a crescent of river stones, each one the size of a fist. In the center of the crescent was a woven circle made from stripped willow, tight and perfect, and inside the circle were 3 objects: a shed elk antler, a bundle of dried sage tied with grass, and a carved piece of cedar, no bigger than my thumb, shaped like a sitting figure with its arms crossed. I picked up the cedar carving and turned it in the light. The detail was extraordinary. Individual fingers, the curve of a spine, The suggestion of a face without features? It was not crude. It was deliberate. I carried it back to the overhang. Ember saw it and made a sound like a question. Ash reached for it, held it in his palm, and then placed it carefully on the wooden crate where they kept their things. He did not look at me. He looked toward the trees, and he hummed a single low note that felt like a reply sent into the distance. Someone was still out there. Someone had been watching, and whoever it was had just told me, in a language older than English, that they knew where the twins were, and that for now they were allowing it. I did not sleep for 3 nights after that. I kept my shotgun loaded and my ears open. But no one came, no sound, no movement, just the forest doing what it does, keeping its secrets and watching to see if I could keep mine. By the time the twins reached what I guessed to be adolescence, sometime in their 5th year with me, which would have made them perhaps 7 or 8 in their own developmental curve, they had outgrown everything I could build and most of what I thought I understood. Ash stood nearly 7 feet tall, his shoulders broad enough that he had to turn sideways to fit through the tunnel entrance. His hair had thickened into a dark auburn pelt that ran from crown to mid-back, and along his temples fine streaks of cream had begun to appear like frost on bark. He moved with an economy that unnerved me, no wasted motion, every step deliberate, every sound catalogued before he reacted to it. He had become a hunter without ever hunting, a scout without ever leaving my land. Ember was shorter but wider through the chest and hips, built like someone who could carry weight over distance and never complain. Her hair was darker, nearly black, and she wore it in a way I can only describe as braided, though I never saw her braid it. It simply fell into thick, twisted ropes that she would coil and pin with sharpened sticks. She had an obsessive love of patterns, stars, spirals, radiating lines. She would spend hours arranging pine cones and mandalas on the floor of the overhang, or scratching geometric sequences into the dirt with a stick, her face intent as any engineer's. They no longer needed me the way they had in those first desperate months, and that was both a relief and a grief I was not prepared for. The overhang had become too exposed. In the spring of their 5th year, after snowmelt had opened the trails and brought the first trickle of tourists and fishermen back into the mountains, I made the decision to expand. I could not build up. The canopy was too thin, and smoke from any structure would be visible. I could not build out. The meadow below was too open. So I built down. I reinforced the tunnel and extended it another 30 feet into the hillside, shoring it with railroad ties I salvaged from an old spur line that had been abandoned since the 1950s. At the end of the tunnel, I excavated a chamber large enough for both of them to stand, stretch, and sleep without touching the walls. I framed it with timber, insulated the ceiling with layers of sod and moss, and cut ventilation shafts disguised as burrows and root hollows. I lined the floor with river sand and flat stones they could arrange however they liked. It took me 4 months. I lost weight I could not afford to lose. My hands developed calluses on top of calluses. But when it was done, the chamber was invisible from above, warm in winter, cool in summer, and quiet enough that you could hear your own heartbeat. The twins moved in without ceremony. Ash walked the perimeter once, testing the walls with his knuckles, then nodded. Ember brought her collection of cones and stones and feathers down in armfuls and arranged them on a natural shelf in the stone. That night, I heard them humming together in a harmony that made the tunnel vibrate, and I knew I had done something right. I also knew I was building a prison as much as a sanctuary, and I hated myself a little for it. The world was changing faster than I could track. By 2010, the valley had seen an influx of new people. Retirees from California buying up cabins, young couples with tech money working remotely, adventure tourists hiring guides to hike trails that used to be empty. The old logging roads were being graded and widened. Cell towers went up on 3 ridges within 10 miles of my property. Drones, those small flying cameras people used for filming, started appearing in the skies, buzzing like mechanical wasps. I began to see the twins' world shrinking in real time. Where they used to roam at night as far as the creek and the meadow edge, I now had to restrict them to the immediate slope. Where they used to vocalize freely, I taught them to keep silent unless we were deep underground or the wind was high enough to cover sound. I hated every rule I imposed, but the alternative was exposure, and exposure meant loss of them, of me, of whatever fragile trust we had built. Ash understood the danger instinctively. He would freeze at the sound of an engine a mile away, head cocked, nostrils flaring, until he placed it and decided whether to retreat. Ember understood it intellectually but resented it. She began to test boundaries, climbing higher into the trees than I wanted, lingering too long at the tunnel mouth, humming low and long in the daytime when she thought I could not hear. One morning in July, I found her sitting at the forest edge, in full daylight, staring down at the valley, where the sun was turning the river into a ribbon of chrome. She did not move when I approached. She did not acknowledge me at all. "Ember," I said quietly, "you cannot be here. Not now. Not in the light." She turned her head and looked at me, and in her eyes I saw something I had hoped I would never see, the beginning of anger, not at me specifically, at the cage I had made however necessary. She stood, towering, powerful, young, and walked back toward the tunnel without a sound. I stood there alone and felt the weight of 15 years settle onto my shoulders like wet canvas. I taught them what I could. I taught them to fish with their hands the way my father had taught me, and they surpassed me within a season. I taught them to read the weather by the color of the sky and the flight of the swallows. I taught them to move through the forest without breaking twigs or disturbing the duff, though they already knew that better than I ever would. In return, they taught me things I had no names for. Ash taught me to listen with my whole body, not just my ears. He would place my hand on a tree trunk and hum until I could feel the resonance travel through the wood and into my bones. He taught me that trees talk to each other, not in words, but in vibrations, and that if you are still enough, you can hear the conversation. Ember taught me pattern languages. She showed me that the way water moves over stone follows the same spiral logic as the way seeds arrange in a cone, and that both follow the same curve you see in a hawk's flight when it rides a thermal. She could not explain it in English. She had perhaps 24 spoken words by then, all of them concrete, but she could show me with her hands, her drawings, her arrangements of objects that I would find in the morning and study like hieroglyphs. They taught me that intelligence is not one thing. It is a forest, and I had been living in a single tree. The gifts from the forest continued. Not often, sometimes months would pass with nothing, but they came, always at the tree line, always arranged with intention. In the fall of 2012, I found a deer hide, tanned and soft, folded into a square and weighted with a stone. In the spring of 2013, a bundle of cattail roots, peeled and clean, tied with braided grass. In the winter of 2014, a necklace of bird bones and glass beads. The beads were old, the kind you find in abandoned homesteads, cobalt and amber. I brought each gift to the twins. Ash would examine them carefully, then place them on the shelf in the chamber with the carved cedar figure from that first year. Ember would hum a specific two-note phrase each time, and after the third gift, I realized it was the same phrase. A name, maybe, or a title, someone. "Who is it?" I asked once, knowing I would not get an answer I could understand. Ash tapped his chest, then Ember's. Then he swept his hand in a wide arc that encompassed the ceiling, the walls, the world beyond. Us, them, all. "Family?" I said. He made a sound that was neither yes nor no. He touched his forehead, then mine, then pointed to the carved figure. "Remember, wait, trust, I was being evaluated. I understood that much." Whatever clan or family or people the twins belonged to, they were still out there, still watching, still deciding whether the human who had taken two of their youngest was a threat or an ally. I did not know which I was. Most days, I did not think I qualified as either. In 2016, the first drone came. It was a small quadcopter, white and red, with a camera mounted on a gimbal. It came up the valley in the late afternoon, following the creek, and it buzzed over my property at a height of maybe 60 feet. I heard it before I saw it, a high insect whine that set my teeth on edge. I stepped onto the porch and watched it hover, tilt, and sweep back toward the slope. The camera rotated. I waved casual like a man with nothing to hide. The drone lingered for another 30 seconds, then turned and flew back down the valley. I went straight to the tunnel. Ash was already at the entrance, pressed flat against the wall, his breathing shallow. Ember was in the chamber, motionless in the darkest corner. Neither of them moved until I gave the all clear. "New thing," I said, drawing a square in the dirt and sketching a propeller on each corner. "Flies, watches, goes away. No danger if you stay hidden." Ash reached out and smudged the drawing with his palm, erasing it. Then he drew a single eye in the center of the space, watching. "Yes," I said, "always watching now." That night, I lay awake and thought about what it would take to leave, to pack up, take the twins, and disappear into some roadless stretch of wilderness where the drones did not go and the people did not follow. But I was past 50 by then, and my knees were bad, and the twins were too large to travel in daylight. We were pinned. The forest had become a waiting room, and I did not know what we were waiting for. The winter of 2018 brought the worst cold I had seen in 20 years. The snow piled 6 feet deep in the meadow, and the road into my property became impassable for weeks at a time. I burned through my winter wood faster than I wanted and started cutting green fir, which smoked too much and gave me a cough I could not shake. The twins stayed underground for days at a time. I brought them food, water, and news from the radio, weather reports, fire outlooks, the occasional local story. They listened in silence, and I wondered what they made of a world that did not include them. One night, during a lull in the storms, Ash gestured for me to follow him up into the trees. He moved fast, even in snowshoes, and I struggled to keep up. We climbed to a ridgeline I rarely visited, and there he stopped and pointed. Below us, spread across the valley, were lights. Not the few scattered lamps of homesteads, but a grid of them. Porch lights, street lights, headlights on new roads. A subdivision had been carved into the bench land east of the river. 40 homes where there had been none 2 years before. Ash turned to me and made a sound I had never heard from him, a low, mournful note that climbed and broke. It was not anger, it was grief. I put my hand on his shoulder, and he did not pull away. We stood there in the cold and watched the lights until my feet went numb, and then we went home. The sign came in early spring of 2019. I found it at dawn, a line of steel snares strung along a game trail half a mile from my property line. They were new, the cable bright and unweathered, baited with chunks of smoked meat, legal for coyote and fox, deadly for anything else that walked on 4 legs, or 2. I pulled every snare I could find, 12 in all, and stuffed them in a sack. That night, I returned and walked the trail with a red beam flashlight, looking for more. I found tracks instead, fresh, barefoot, massive. They crossed the trail where the snares had been, then stopped. One print was smudged, as if the walker had knelt. Beside it, drawn in the snow with a stick or a claw, was a symbol I recognized from the gifts, a circle with a line through it. No. Stop. Danger. Someone had found the snares before I did. Someone had marked them and walked away. I followed the tracks as far as I dared, but they led into thick timber where the snow was wind-scoured and unreadable. I turned back and returned to my cabin, and I did not sleep. 2 nights later, I heard the keening. It came from the north, high-pitched and raw, a sound that made my spine go rigid. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and ran toward it, my breath tearing in my chest. I found them a 1/4 mile into the forest, Ash and Ember kneeling beside a third figure, smaller than either of them, lying on its side in the snow. It was another Sasquatch, younger, with pale russet hair and a gash across its thigh that wept dark blood into the white. One leg was mangled, twisted at an angle that made my stomach turn. A snare. It had stepped into a snare I had missed, and the cable had cut to the bone before it broke free. Ash looked up at me, his face stricken. Ember was pressing moss to the wound, her hands shaking. The young one's breathing was fast and shallow, its eyes half closed. I knelt and examined the leg. The bone was broken, the muscle shredded. Even if I could stop the bleeding, infection would take it in days. I had no antibiotics, no surgical tools, no way to explain to a vet or a doctor what I was treating. I looked at Ash and shook my head. He understood. He made a sound that started deep and climbed into a wail, and Ember joined him, and the forest filled with a grief so thick I could barely breathe through it. The young one died just before dawn. Its chest stopped rising, and the keening stopped with it. Ash and Ember wrapped the body in fir boughs and carried it deeper into the timber, and I followed at a distance. They laid it in a hollow beneath a lightning-scarred cedar and covered it with stones and moss and woven branches. Ember pressed her forehead to the mound and did not move for a long time. When we returned to the cabin, Ash smeared a line of ash across my doorframe with his thumb, thick, deliberate, final. Then he turned and walked back to the tunnel without looking at me. For 3 days, neither of them would come when I called. I left food at the tunnel mouth, and it went untouched. On the 4th day, Ember emerged, her eyes red-rimmed, and she took the food without meeting my gaze. Ash did not come out at all. I understood. I had brought them into a world that killed their kind. I had kept them alive, but I had also kept them caged, and the cage had failed to protect anyone who was not already inside it. I sat on my porch that night and wondered if love and harm could be separated, or if they were always two faces of the same choice. The carved cedar round appeared again in late spring, left on the stump at the tree line where the first gifts had been. But this time it was different. The concentric rings were still there, burned into the wood, but now there were new marks, lines radiating out from the center, each one ending in a small notch. I counted them. 14. I counted again. 14. Ash came to the porch that evening and stood in the shadows where the lamplight did not reach. I showed him the round. He took it, ran his thumb over the notches, and then tapped the center dot, my cabin, and made a sweeping gesture toward the trees. 14 what? I asked. 14 people? 14 watchers? He tapped his chest. Embers. Then he held up both hands, fingers spread. 10. Then 4 more fingers. 14. 14 of you, I said slowly. 14 out there. He nodded. Then he turned the round over. On the back, burned in a single clean line, was a new symbol, a curve like a crescent moon, open side up, with a dot above it. I did not know what it meant, but I knew it was a message, and I knew, with the certainty of a man who has lived alone too long, that the silence between me and the forest was about to end. The fire started on a Tuesday in late August of 2020, the kind of day when the sky turns the color of old brass and the air tastes like the inside of a kiln. I woke to the smell of smoke, not the clean cedar smell of my stove, but the wild resinous stink of a forest beginning to burn. The radio confirmed it before I could see the flames, a lightning strike 16 miles northwest, wind pushing it hard toward the drainages that fed into my valley. Crews were already overrun on the main ridge. Evacuations were voluntary for now, mandatory by evening if the wind held. I stood on my porch and watched the horizon blur. Somewhere in my chest, a trapdoor opened onto a memory 15 years old. 2 small bodies in the smoke, a choice I made without thinking, the weight of them against my ribs as I carried them out of the fire that had taken everything else from them. I was 53 years old. My knees ached in the morning, and my lungs were scarred from decades of smoke and dust. The twins were no longer twins in any sense but history. They were adults, powerful and wary, and they had been pulling away from me for 2 years, ever since the young one died in the snow. I did not blame them. I had saved them once and failed to save another. The math was clear. I went to the tunnel entrance and knocked. 2, pause. 1, the all clear. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. I descended into the chamber. It was empty. Their belongings were still arranged on the stone shelf, the gifts, the woven mats, the carved cedar figure. But the twins were gone. A cold dread settled over me, the kind you feel when you realize you have lost something you will not get back. I climbed out and walked the perimeter of the property, calling their names in the low hum-click language I had learned. The forest swallowed the sound and gave nothing in return. They were gone. They had left without goodbye, and I told myself it was the right thing, the smart thing, the thing I should have encouraged years ago. I told myself I was relieved. I believed none of it. By nightfall, the fire had jumped 2 ridge lines and was burning in a wide crescent east and north. The wind was erratic, gusting and shifting, the kind of wind that turns firefighters into gamblers. I loaded my truck with what mattered, my grandmother's quilt, the green canvas notebook with 15 years of observations, a box of photographs from a life before the twins, and the carved cedar round with 14 notches. I did not load the shotgun. I did not load the chainsaw. I sat on the tailgate and waited for a reason to leave, and none came. The sky turned the color of a plum gone bad. Ash began to fall, fine and soft, landing on my shoulders like a parody of snow. I heard helicopters to the north, the thrum of rotors laboring under the weight of water buckets. I heard voices on the radio, clipped and urgent, calling for backup on the main line. I heard my own breath, shallow and tight, and I realized I was not leaving because I did not know how to leave them behind a second time. At midnight, Ember returned. She came out of the trees in silence, moving low and fast, and she stopped at the edge of the clearing. Her chest was heaving, her hair tangled with twigs and ash. She did not approach the cabin. She stood at the tree line and made a sound I had not heard in years, the tapping call from that first night, rapid and urgent. I stood and walked toward her. She did not retreat. When I was 10 feet away, she dropped to one knee and dragged a long cedar bough from behind her, its needles still green. She laid it on the ground between us. The bough was marked. Daubed along its length in thick gray clay were symbols I recognized from the gifts and the cedar rounds. Circles, lines, crescents. In the center, 2 connected marks, twin points side by side, and around them a larger circle made of many smaller marks, each one slightly different. She tapped the twin points, her, Ash. Then she tapped the larger circle and swept her hand toward the forest. Others, many. Your family, I said. She tilted her head and I understood. Yes, but more than family, clan, people, the ones who had been watching all these years. She pointed to me, then to the cedar bough, then toward the trees. Come, now. They want me to come? I said, and my voice cracked. Why now? She stood and turned, and for a moment I thought she would leave without waiting. But she looked back over her shoulder and made a sound that was not quite a word, but close enough. A breathy, guttural syllable that sounded like home. I followed. We moved through the forest in near darkness, the only light a dull orange glow filtering through the smoke from the northwest. Ember led, her broad back a shadow I tracked by sound as much as sight. She did not slow for me, but she did not lose me either. She knew the limits of my stride, my breath, my aging legs. We climbed. The terrain grew steeper, rockier, the trees thinning into snags and low Crumholz pine. My lungs burned, my knees screamed. I kept moving because stopping meant losing her, and losing her meant dying alone on a ridge in the smoke, and I was not ready for that. After an hour, maybe more, we crested a shoulder of stone and dropped into a saddle I had never seen. The wind was different here, cooler, steadier, carrying the smell of water. Ahead, the trees thickened again into old growth, Douglas fir and cedar, trunks wide as truck beds, canopies so dense the firelight barely reached. Ember stopped. She turned and placed a hand on my chest, firm and deliberate. Wait. She stepped forward into the darkness and made a 3-note call, rising and falling. It echoed off the stone and vanished into the canopy. Silence. Then, from a dozen different directions, the call came back. Not identical, but variations on a theme, voices layered in a harmony that made the air itself vibrate. The forest moved. One by one, they detached from the shadows. Figures twice my height, broad-shouldered and deliberate, hair in shades of rust and charcoal and silver. They stepped into the faint light with a silence that defied their size, and they formed a loose circle around me. 6, then 9, then 12. I stopped counting. I stopped breathing. One of them stepped forward, a figure larger than the rest, moving with the weight and authority of age. Her hair was the color of iron, braided with strands of dry grass and river reed, and her forehead bore a jagged scar that ran from brow to temple, an old lightning burn pale against dark skin. She stopped an arm's length from me and inhaled, long and slow, her nostrils flaring. She was scenting me, reading my fear, my exhaustion, my history. Then she exhaled, and the sound came in layers, a low hum that climbed and split into harmonics, a chord that resonated in my ribs and made my teeth ache. It was not a threat. It was a question. Ash stepped out from behind her. He was taller than I remembered, broader, his face harder. He looked at me with eyes that held no anger, only assessment. He touched his chest, then Ember's, then swept his hand toward the circle of figures. Us. Then he pointed at me and tapped his own chest twice. You. Heart. The matriarch tilted her head, watching, waiting. I understood. This was not a welcome. It was a reckoning. They had come to judge whether the human who had taken 2 of their youngest from a burning forest 15 years ago had earned the right to stand in their presence, or whether he was just another thief in a long line of thieves. I had no defense but the truth. I spread my hands and spoke, low and steady, knowing they would understand the tone, if not the words. I found them in the fire, I said. They were burning. Alone, I carried them out because I could not leave them. I have kept them hidden because the world would take them from me and cage them or kill them. I have fed them, taught them, tried to keep them safe. I know I failed. I know one of yours died because I missed a snare. I know I have kept them from you, but I did not steal them. I saved them, and if that was wrong, I will answer for it. But I will not lie about it. The matriarch stepped closer. She raised one massive hand and placed it flat against my chest, directly over my heart. Her palm was rough, calloused, warm. She held it there and closed her eyes, and I felt her listening, not to my words, but to the rhythm of my pulse, the catch in my breath, the small tells of a body that cannot lie. Behind her, the others were still, no sound but the wind in the high branches and the distant growl of the fire. She opened her eyes and removed her hand. She turned to Ash, then to Ember, and made a sound like a question. Ash stepped forward. He placed his hand on my shoulder, then on the matriarch's, bridging us. He hummed a long 2-tone note, and Ember joined him, and the harmony swelled until the whole circle was singing. The matriarch raised her hand. The singing stopped. She gestured toward the forest, a single sweeping motion. Follow. They led me deeper into the saddle, past stone outcrops, and through groves of cedar so old the bark hung in shaggy curtains. We descended into a bowl carved by ancient fire, its walls steep and sheltering, its floor soft with moss and duff. And there, hidden beneath the canopy, was a place I had no name for. Shelters, if you could call them that. Woven bough frames lashed with braided bark, thatched with fern and cedar, low and seamless against the stone. Caches of food hung high in the trees, bundles wrapped in hide, dried roots and fish, clay pots sealed with pitch, fire pits ringed with stone, cold now but scoured clean, and along the far wall, carved into a smooth face of basalt, a spiral record. symbols etched and burned into the stone in a pattern that radiated out from a central point, layer upon layer, a living archive. The matriarch led me to the stone. She placed her palm against it, and one by one the others did the same, young and old, male and female, each touching the spiral and holding for a breath before stepping back. Then she turned to me and gestured. "Your turn." I stepped forward. My hand looked small and pale against the dark stone. I pressed it flat and felt the cold, the grain, the weight of time beneath my palm. I did not know what I was touching, history, memory, prayer, but I knew it was sacred, and I knew I had been allowed to see it. The matriarch reached into a pouch at her side and withdrew something wrapped in soft hide. She unfolded it slowly. My work gloves from the night of the fire burned and stiff with age. I had left them in the chamber on the shelf, thinking they were forgotten. She placed them in a niche beside the spiral, nestled them into the stone as if they belonged there. Then she pressed her palm to the gloves, then to the spiral, then to my chest. The circle of figures stepped forward and struck their chests in unison, a single percussive thump that rolled through the bowl like thunder. All but two, a pair of younger males who stood apart, arms folded, faces set in distrust. They did not strike. They did not move. The matriarch saw them and made a low sound, not a reprimand, but an acknowledgment. Not everyone agrees, not everyone forgives, but the clan had spoken, and the clan had chosen. She turned and gestured again. This way. We climbed out of the bowl and up onto the rim, where the smoke was thicker and the orange glow had brightened to a hard, angry red. From the ridge, I could see the fire, a ragged line of light chewing through the timber miles wide, moving fast. It was close, too close. The matriarch stood beside me and pointed toward the valley, toward the scatter of lights that marked the new subdivision, the roads, the houses. Then she pointed to the fire, and then to herself, to the circle of her clan. She made a sound that was part growl, part sigh, a sound that meant, "This is what comes. This is what we run from. This is what takes everything." Ash stepped up beside me. He pointed to the fire, then to the valley, then to me. He made a gesture I had taught him years ago. Hands together, then pulled apart. Separation, loss. "You're leaving," I said. He nodded. "Because of the fire?" He shook his head. He pointed to the valley lights, then mimed a square, a house, a box, a cage. Then he swept his hand wide, empty. No room, no forest, no home. I felt the truth of it settle in my gut. The fire was just the final push. The real reason was the slow, relentless creep of people and roads and lights into every last wild place. There was no room left for a people the world refused to see. "Where will you go?" I asked, knowing he could not answer. He pointed north, then higher, toward the peaks that never lost their snow. Beyond the roads, beyond the maps. Ember took my hand. She pressed something into my palm, a small woven circle, no bigger than a coin, made from grass and hair braided tight. In the center, a tiny carved bead of cedar. She closed my fingers over it and hummed the two-note phrase I had heard 100 times. Remember? The matriarch raised her hand, and the clan began to move, silent, purposeful, flowing into the trees like water into stone. Ash and Ember lingered. Ash touched his forehead to mine, a gesture I had never seen from him, and then he turned and followed. Ember looked back once. Her eyes caught the firelight, bright and gold, and then she was gone. I stood on the ridge alone, and watched them disappear into the smoke and the dark, and I understood that I had not lost them. I had been allowed to love them for a time, and now that time was done, and I would carry it the rest of my life like a scar that never stops aching. The sound of boots on gravel snapped me back, voices, human and urgent, calling through the smoke. A flashlight beam swept the trees below the ridge. "Hey, anyone up here? We are doing sweeps for stragglers." I turned and started down the slope, moving slow, making noise so they would hear me coming. 2 firefighters met me halfway, young men with soot-streaked faces and eyes too wide. "Sir, you need to get out. This whole ridge is going to light off in an hour." "I know," I said. "I am going." "You see anyone else up here? We got reports of movement, something big." "Elk," I said. "Whole herd moving north. Spooked by the fire?" One of them nodded, too tired to question. The other looked past me toward the ridge line, his flashlight sweeping the smoke. For a moment I thought he saw something, but then he turned and waved me forward. "Come on, we will get you down to the staging area." I followed them down through the smoke and the ash, and I did not look back. My cabin burned 3 days later. The fire took the ridge, the meadow, the trees I had known by name. It took the tunnel and the chamber and the overhang. It took everything but the stone and the memory. I stayed with Ada for a week, sleeping on her couch and drinking her bitter coffee, and I did not tell her why I cried in the night. When the evacuation order lifted, I drove back up the road and stood in the black where my home had been. The carved cedar round was still there, untouched in the root cellar that had somehow survived. I dug it out of the ash and held it in both hands. 14 notches. A crescent moon with a dot above. I never learned what it meant, but I carried it with me when I left the valley for good, packed in a canvas bag with my grandmother's quilt, and the green notebook, and the woven circle Ember had given me. I am 60 now. I live in a small rented room in a town where no one knows my name. I work part-time at a hardware store, cutting keys and mixing paint. At night, I sit by the window and look at the hills beyond the streetlights, and I wonder if they made it, if they found a place the roads have not reached, if the young ones are learning the old ways, and if the matriarch still carries my gloves in her pouch as proof that one human once made a choice that mattered. I do not expect to see them again, but sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is very still, I hear a sound in the distance, a low, layered hum that makes my ribs vibrate, and I tap my chest twice, the way Ash taught me. Remember? I do. I will.